So those who are high in gender RS presumably will experience more threat in the environment. And we reasoned that that would produce unstable gender STEM identity compatibility in the spring. So for identity compatibility, we used a modified version of the inclusion of other in self questionnaire designed by Art Aaron. And similar modifications have been used with women in STEM in past published work. And it essentially looks like this. It's a series of overlapping circles, progressively overlapping. And we asked participants, how compatible do you think your gender identity is with being a STEM major? And so you can see over here that we have gender in one circle, STEM major in another. And there's this progressing series of circles from which they go from very disconnected to extremely compatible. And that measure was administered weekly for 14 weeks throughout the spring semester. And like past work by Aronson and Inslip, instability or fluctuations was computed by calculating the within-person variability over the semester, so the within-person standard deviation across time. So in this case, higher numbers indicates a larger standard deviation or less stability. So we then theorized, as Aronson and Inslip suggested, that unstable identity compatibility might go on to impair outcomes later in time. And this sort of makes sense if you think of unstable identity compatibility as maybe a form of belongingness uncertainty. So they're sort of constantly questioning whether or not they really belong in this field. And so for our outcomes at fall follow-up, we were interested in two things. So as Catherine Good recently suggested in one of her papers, it turns out that subjective belonging is extremely predictive of STEM success. So we wanted to measure that. And for this we measured sense of belonging in STEM, evaluative threat. So this is a measure of people's concerns with appearing competent in the STEM domain. And finally, we wanted to see if these fluctuations might ultimately impact identity compatibility itself, which, as we mentioned, past work has shown is highly predictive of STEM success. And secondly, we also wanted to look beyond subjective measures to look at objective performance. So we obtained the official academic transcripts from the university for the fall semester of their sophomore year of college. And we used these to compute both their STEM GPA and their non-STEM GPA. So one possibility that we wanted to guard against is perhaps those who have unstable identity compatibility in the spring may have just a broad academic decline the following fall. So we wanted to isolate whether or not that decline might be STEM specific or more broad. So just to walk you through the model one more time, so those who are low in gender RS presumably would perceive less threat in the environment, have a more stable sense of identity compatibility, and then go on to have more favorable outcomes. So, does projection sensitivity predict larger fluctuations in identity compatibility? A regression model found support for this hypothesis, suggesting that those high in gender RS did have a less stable sense of identity compatibility the following spring. And just so you're aware, all of these analyses I'm presenting now control for initial level of overall identity compatibility, an academic success measure, so their self-reported high school GPA, and personal RS, which is a sort of general sensitivity to rejection measure that's non-specific to gender. So next, we wanted to examine whether these fluctuations in identity compatibility might go on to predict follow-up outcomes. And for this, we examined all of our subjective measures, in addition to our objective measures of success. And what we found is that fluctuations in identity compatibility did indeed predict poorer STEM identity compatibility, lower sense of belonging, and higher concerns of evaluative threat. So it did seem to be the case that this unstable identity compatibility went on to affect subjective well-being the next year. And finally, we wanted to look at academic outcomes as well. And we found that indeed, fluctuations in compatibility did predict lower STEM GPA the following year. And again, this is from the official university transcripts, not self-reports. However, in contrast, fluctuations in compatibility did not predict non-STEM GPA. So we have reason to believe that it's not a general decline in success that's responsible for this effect. And just to give you a visual of what this looks like, where on the y-axis is GPA, and we have STEM GPA and non-STEM GPA. Depending on individuals who are more or less stable in identity compatibility, in their non-STEM courses, they look pretty much the same. But when we look at their STEM courses, those who have less stable identity compatibility do far poorer than those who have more stable identity compatibility. And just so you're aware, this was a continuous measure. It's been broken up for the sake of this graph. So we wanted to go on to ask, why might this actually predict unstable identity compatibility? And so we reasoned earlier that gender RS is supposed to be related to stronger reactions to threat. So we looked back at the data we collected earlier in the year, and during the 14 weeks during the spring semester, participants were also asked to describe the most significant event that they experienced that week, and just write an open-ended response. They were then asked to indicate whether it was positive or negative, and what kind of interaction it was, whether it was academic or some other kind of interaction. And so we reasoned that identity compatibility would decline after experiencing a negative academic experience or a threatening experience, but only for those who were high in gender RS. And we found support for this prediction. So identity compatibility is here on the y-axis. Individuals low in gender RS, whether they had a negative academic event or not, their identity compatibility was about the same. In contrast, for women who had higher levels of gender RS, had a big decrease in identity compatibility following a negative academic event. And so we also wanted to guard against the possibility that perhaps gender RS individuals, high gender RS women, might just be generally reactive to these kinds of negative events. So we also, instead of looking at negative academic events, we looked at negative social events. So are women having the same kind of response to negative social events as well? And we found that there was no interaction. And this is not a significant main effect. So, what do these results tell us? We found that women high in gender RS did show less stable identity compatibility during their second semester of college. That those high in gender RS experienced a decline in identity compatibility following a threatening event. And importantly, that these fluctuations in identity compatibility predicted impaired outcomes at follow-up. And this was true for both subjective belonging variables, but actual academic success as well. So a couple of the questions we have going forward with this work. When does STEM identity stabilize? So this is the freshman year of college. So one possibility is that this instability exists only during transition points, like entering college. But because there are still threats in the environment, this might be a constant struggle for women. And I can tell you that some very preliminary analyses of our graduate students suggest that they look somewhat similar, that those high in gender threat or gender RS are still experiencing greater fluctuations. And finally, and Janessa's going to talk a little bit about interventions more shortly, but we want to know whether or not interventions can reduce this instability. So does participating in a STEM support program or having role models either prevent this instability or buffer the negative effects of it? So we'd like to thank the NSF and our co-authors and our co-PIs. Thank you very much.